Alrighty, hello everybody and good morning. You're listening to another episode of Talking TWAMPs. Today we will be discussing the up and coming midterms. It is right now just the very tail end of September and November is quick approaching, which means a potentially big turnover for many politicians involved in these upcoming elections. But before we get into the nitty-gritty, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Blake Phillips. You may have heard me on previous podcasts, or if this is your first time, welcome. I'm a government major, doubling up in German, and now I will pass you all over to my left for some introductions.
My name is George Barrows. This is my first time on the podcast, so thank you very much for having me, guys.
Woohoo!
I am an international relations and Russian and post-Soviet studies double major.
My name is Vincent. I am an economics major, doubling up in data science, so I like a lot of numbers and data.
It's alright, Vince. We all make mistakes.
Yikes.
And I'm Joe. I am also an international relations and Russian studies major, and I get the feeling that I'm being replaced.
Ooh, dangerous.
My name is Jakob. I am an international relations major, but my focus is in Latin America, and I am beginning to feel like we're being infiltrated by the Russians.
Oh.
Fair enough. Alright, so as I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, today we'll be talking about the 2018 midterm elections. A lot of times political pundits pitch these midterms as the first time to see a popular referendum on the president's policies on a large scale. We've obviously seen a couple of elections where the president has attempted to weigh in, special elections as senators retire or as people drop out for various reasons in the House. But again, this is the first time that the nation will be weighing in on politics via a vote, and again, in a way that may be seen as a referendum by certain pundits. Let's just start out with the obvious. Right now, we've got a lot of hot button stuff going on in the Senate. But if we're honest with ourselves, the Senate's always kind of a hot button area. That's where all the nominations get confirmed. It's where bills often get most amended most actively, just because there are fewer members to make the amending happen. So let's go there. I know we've got a couple of hot button elections in the Senate, but let's start off with somebody name an election that they're watching and what they think is going to happen and what might be interesting there.
So right in our backyard, actually, well, more or less, Tim Kaine versus Corey Stewart. Tim Kaine, of course, the vice presidential running mate with Hillary Clinton in 2016. But he's been our senator here in Virginia for quite a long time. Corey Stewart was a failed Republican candidate for governor in our last governor race. And he's a strong supporter of President Trump and President Trump's policies. So we're really seeing, at least kind of spiritually, a redo of 2016 in a way.
It couldn't be clearer. Corey Stewart backed Trump very early in Virginia, and Virginia went for Kaine-Hillary. But
Not by much, though.
But not by much.
1%, maybe?
Yeah, I think.
Right?
Well, not 1. I think it was closer to 3.
3.
But still, you're right. A very, very slim margin. So this is definitely something that is interesting to watch. I'd be interested to hear from all of you. How close do we really think this election is? I know that 3% is a tight margin, but if it's a consistent 3%, then maybe it's not as worrisome for the Democrats. That being said, we've seen Virginia change. I mean, now it's considered a decently blue state, but it was not very long ago within our lifetimes that people thought it was going to be red for a very long time. So anybody got thoughts on how contentious this election is between Kaine and Stewart?
And I think it's pretty clear from the polling data that's come out that Tim Kaine is on track to win the election. And what's interesting about that is, like you said, it was a 3% margin in 2016. Kaine's margin over Corey Stewart is much larger than that.
Is it now?
Yeah, it is. It is considerably. I mean, it's not enormous. It's not 60%.
Right, we're not talking 60-40 or anything.
Right, but it is consistently large. And I think what that says is Trump captured something in the 2016 election, captured a kind of anti-establishment movement, but that doesn't translate necessarily to successes for his allies downstream, especially in states like Virginia, where Tim Kaine he's an establishment pick, but he's a popular one. Unlike Hillary Clinton, he is really genuinely popular in Virginia.
And
I would say that's one of the keys that a lot of pundits who take the large view are missing about the midterm elections, and especially the Senate races, that people try to take the swing from 2016 to the polls to try to predict what's going to happen. But the fact of the matter is that local elections are often predicated on very different issues than national elections. And we're seeing that actually in a lot of Senate races.
And by local, I just want to clarify, you mean state level.
Yes, yeah. The world is getting smaller.
Fair enough.
And you can see this most clearly in the fact that there are a lot of states which went for Trump by overwhelming margins.
We're talking West Virginia, we're talking...
Well, I'll tell you exactly what I have in mind, which are either competitive or are looking at this moment to elect Democratic senators by similarly large margins. West Virginia, which you mentioned, is a great example. Went for Trump by something like 40 points, if I recall
ridiculous
correctly.
margin in politics.
But right now, the Democratic candidate, Joe Manchin, has such a personal local popularity that he's currently favored by a significant margin, like single digits, but high single digits to win. The same is true of our favorite senator here on the podcast, Senator Sherrod Brown of Ohio.
Ooh, I don't know about that.
And the same is true to a lesser extent of incumbent Democrats in Indiana, Missouri, and North Dakota and Montana.
If the Sherrod Brown reference was foreign to you, listener, I would recommend that you go back and listen to about half of our other podcasts. You will hear Joe mention the good senator from Ohio.
And we saw that earlier, too, in the special election in Alabama, which obviously that's a special case because the Republican nominee was, to be frank, a pedophile.
Roy Moore.
But it's clear that, Alabama went overwhelmingly for Trump, and it is a solidly red state now, and Doug Jones won. Yeah,
I was going to say something along your lines, Joe, but I think you've mentioned it very well. I think another point I had in mind was that maybe now that Trump is already given some power and people have seen what he's capable of, what he wants to do, I feel like a lot of the people that really, really support Trump in the beginning are facing some backlash because maybe there's some moderate Republicans that are like, or relatively moderate to Trump, are like, maybe Trump is a bit too extreme. And so maybe that's why in Virginia we can see a bigger margin because maybe the supporters of Corey, I shouldn't call him by his first name. Damn it, what is his last name? Stewart. Think of my friend Corey, sorry. Corey Stewart. Maybe a lot of his supporters felt like, Trump is a bit too much, and if I support Corey, I will also be supporting something that I think is too much. And so maybe they switch back into Kane. I guess what I'm saying is 2016, people thought, okay, Trump is the better pick because he's anti-establishment. He's not really going to build a wall. Maybe some people think that way. And now he was pushing for it, and then he pushed the end to the DACA Act, so forth and so on. And now people are like, yeah, maybe he's a bit too much. And that's why we're seeing the dip in the polls.
That's probably true for a lot of, I think, Nova Republicans, so to speak. Blake, our good friend's neighbors.
I was about to say, do not try and make me a Nova Republican.
No, but your neighbors.
all five of them.
Yikes.
There are a shocking number of them.
But for them, they're business as usual Republicans, and this is clearly, like Vince said, not business as usual.
And even Corey Stewart, who is a gubernatorial candidate, is not really business as usual when it comes to American politics. So I definitely buy Vince's theory that maybe we're seeing some moderate Republicans, if not switching over to Tim Kaine, then at the very least not going out, not answering polls.
Right, they're staying home.
Right, they're not committing to a candidate here. So Joe, I'm gonna pivot to something that you touched on a little bit briefly, and that's the difference between elect and re-elect. We're seeing a lot of Democratic candidates that are picking up support in states that went for Trump by overwhelming margins. They're set to win their elections, but they're often set to win their re-elections. They're incumbent candidates. McCaskill, Brown, mansion. All of these people are have held their seats for a considerable amount of time and continue to remain decently popular in their states. So what is the difference here? Does anybody want to weigh in between those Democrats that are attempting re-election and those Democrats who are attempting to seize a seat that for a little while has been Republican? I'm thinking about Tennessee, or it's Kentucky, isn't it? Tennessee. I was right the first time. So I'm thinking about Tennessee. I'm thinking about a couple of other states. I think
Texas.
Texas isn't
surprisingly.
But more importantly, I think it's either Alabama or Georgia is also facing.
You're probably thinking the Mississippi special.
Mississippi, that's it. Mississippi. But any of those states where we're not seeing a Democrat try and face re-election in a state that they shouldn't win, just statistically speaking, then Democrats running for the first time to unseat Republican incumbents. What luck do we see in those races?
Well, I think you're very right to bring up the concept of incumbent advantage. I think just from you can compare the states where there is a Democratic incumbent to one where there isn't, and see a massive difference. Between, for example, North Dakota and Nebraska.
Two states that, by and large, are built on very similar economies. It's oil drilling and large crop wheat.
More or less. It is as much as you can get to a fact in politics that it is more difficult to unseat an incumbent than to take an open seat or to keep your seat.
Do you know why that is? In my American politics class, I remember hearing about this, and I think it goes along the lines of that incumbents have more reach given their new power. Is that correct? Like in theory in general?
Well, I remember the working theory being something along the lines of being able to both gear up as you approach an election year by doing more local initiatives, and then also being able to point to your career as a politician at large initiatives that you've been able to push through to the favor of your state. Not to mention, people are just more comfortable without change. You get the idea that I know that they're not necessarily of my party, but nothing's gone particularly poorly while they've been in office, and I don't know anything about this new candidate. So if I can't trust the new candidate's promises, at least I know exactly what's going to happen with this candidate that I've already got in office.
There's also the psychological aspect of just name recognition. The more often that you just see a name, be it positive or negative association, the more familiar that a name is, the more likely it's been shown that people are likely to vote. Like non-committed or low information voters are more likely to vote for a familiar name than one that's brand new and completely alien to
All
them.
publicity is good publicity in politics. I think, if anything, the 2016 election proved that.
Oh, yeah.
And I think the key of name recognition is supported by the trends that we see in some of the elections where a non-incumbent is doing well. For example, you brought up the example of Tennessee, where there's no incumbent, but the Democratic challenger is doing much better than one would expect because he was a former governor who has very high name recognition in the state. Conversely, in Nevada, which is a much more Democratic state, the Democratic challenger is not doing nearly as well as one would expect because, if I understand correctly, she's a congresswoman from some distant part of the state and still was not able to raise her profile as much as one would expect.
Well, to her credit, there are very few parts of the state of Nevada that I would not call distant.
I suppose so.
It's basically one big desert.
And I think that'll become key, that measure of incumbency when we look at somewhere like Texas, where, demographics are destiny, and in Texas, the destiny is probably going to be Democratic. But I think we're probably, for Beto O'Rourke at least, a very interesting race, but 5 or 10 years early on that one.
I thought Texas's blue bits is just Austin.
And most of
South.
the border.
And the South.
Most of the border, Austin, Houston,
El Paso.
Oh.
Any of the major cities bar Dallas are technically.
So why are they always red?
Why is the state always red? It's always red by a very, very small margin. It's always almost by 4% or less.
I had no idea. I thought it was like they're always red forever and
Well,
ever.
this is an interesting distinction that I think not enough people know about, and that's the difference between a swing state and an elastic state. Swinginess and elasticity. Texas is not a swing state, but it can still be close because it's very inelastic, meaning that there are very few people who can change back and forth. A counterexample would be Rhode Island, actually, interestingly enough, which is democratic enough that it it's seen as a safe democratic state, but you get wild swings from year to year because there are so many swing voters.
Right. And so that's sort of the story of Texas right now. Interestingly enough, Joe mentions the inelasticity of Texas. It's become more elastic over the past 4 or 5 years, a lot due to immigration and migration patterns. And I'm not talking about Mexican immigration. Obviously, most immigrants from Mexico aren't citizens and cannot vote. But there's actually a net migration from north to south.
And Californians.
And Californians who are moving inwards. And so that pattern of behavior is beginning to elasticize previously inelastic, close margin states. Texas is only a key example. We're also seeing the same pattern in Georgia.
Okay.
So those sorts of migration patterns are starting to change what our map looks like.
Well, and if we want a concrete example, that is what happened to Virginia. You know, the growth of Northern Virginia is what made it a blue state, undeniably.
Well,
So
there's
Virginia
also
is a
the
swing,
growth of
or-
Richmond and like the Hampton Roads and Norfolk area. That contributed a lot as well.
Right.
Area, which I think, to your point, George, is why we talk about Austin being sort of the blue hotbed of Texas, but in reality, the whole southern border, El Paso, Houston are all technically also blue areas. So Virginia, yes, can credit much of its blue turn to Northern Virginia, but the growth of the Norfolk area, especially in connection with the Navy, and Richmond as well as it grows in population.
How do you pronounce the name of that city? It's Norfolk.
Wait, so Texas is elastic state?
So it's as of right now inelastic, but
it's a swing.
I think we should pivot to this as well. We've talked a little bit about Beto O'Rourke, but I want to, if we can, pick that election apart a little bit more. It's not the same, in most people's eyes, referendum election that we're seeing elsewhere.
No, because Ted Cruz has been very public about his supposed moral opposition to Trump.
So Ted Cruz has ranged wildly on his stance to Trump. When he was running against him, obviously he was very opposed. Then after he dropped out and Trump received the nomination from the RNC.
And his speech in the RNC too, right?
Ted Cruz then began doing cold calls for Trump. But then, once the Senate session started up, Cruz has been rather inconsistent on his stances against and for Trump-supported bills. Not to mention, Ted Cruz is often cited as one of the most hated men in Washington by his own colleagues, but often polls very popular among the state within the state of Texas. On the flip side, we have Beto O'Rourke, who has been sort of a dark horse candidate from the beginning, winning in a very strange manner the Democratic nomination for the Senate seat, and then taking some rather public stances on some very key issues that Texan Democrats tend to avoid. I'm thinking gun control and abortion.
Oh, true.
In a way that has not been done in Texas in a while. And I wonder if this is less of a referendum election and more of an interesting case study, even if he doesn't win, just because of how close he's gotten to Cruz in many polls. An interesting case study of how Democrats might be able to run in the South.
Well, I think it is a referendum, just not on the presidency as such. I mean, you said Beto
Well, in
O'Rourke.
that sense, every election is a referendum.
But a referendum, for instance, on how Democrats need to run in Texas. Democrats in Texas have run as not quite blue dogs, but they've been generally more centrist, more conservative. Maybe they've been willing to negotiate on the Second Amendment or on abortion. Beto O'Rourke has been very, very left for Texas, a solid left Democrat. And he's done well. And so I think it's going to, if he does well, if he comes within, say, 2 or 3 points of Cruz in the election, it's going to send a signal to Democrats, not just in Texas, but in other conservative areas. You can run on the left. You don't have to try and chip away the center.
And it is worth noting that left for Texas is not left for New York.
Yes.
Well, right. A relatively left.
Is there benefit, though, of running more on the left as opposed to the center?
Better voter turnout, basically. You get enthusiasm from the voters who are likely to turn out Democratic.
Arguably, that's the way that Doug Jones ran in Alabama. If I remember correctly, he is pro-abortion rights. Is that correct? In Alabama. And he won primarily through a turnout game, not by convincing anybody.
Conversely, though, also, if you're going to, go for the farther, more radical position in your policy platform for the elections, you also run the risk of having there be higher turnout on the opposing side because they will try to galvanize against what they perceive as radical change.
And I think that the one thing that the Democrats may have playing in their favor when it comes to turnout is just that in off-year elections, so midterms or anything that isn't on the presidency, Republicans tend to turn out more anyway. The idea that you're going to galvanize Republicans by being too far radically left is already a losing battle because the Republicans are going to show up. Your job is to get Democrats to show up.
Well, and there's an interesting parallel with the Doug Jones race in that, Ted Cruz is an incredibly unpopular politician. Not in terms of polling data, but in terms of personal opinions of voters. They don't like him. They'll vote for him, but a lot of them don't like him. And I think there's a parallel with the Alabama race there that the Democrats aren't as concerned with enthusiasm as they are in other races.
I mean, there's a difference between you don't like how he looks and or you're not a big friend and the guy who may have molested people at the age of 30 while they were 13.
Well, yeah, the Alabama race was special.
Unpopular and maybe a rapist.
So, speaking of unfavorable acts in politicians, this might be on a tangential point, but do you think the Brett Kavanaugh issue might hold some water in swinging some voters out of local elections?
So that is
Could
a
that be a
decent
thing?
pivot. We have, obviously the Kavanaugh nomination is the biggest thing in the Senate right now. Do we see Republicans running on getting him elected? Do we, or not elected, confirmed? Do we see Democrats running on preventing any more nominations like his? Or are they running on more local issues? What's the winning strategy with that?
The interesting thing about the Kavanaugh nomination politically, I think, is that the Republicans have been attempting to use the Supreme Court as a way to squeeze the red state Democrats we've been talking about. And I think they did that quite successfully with the Gorsuch nomination, in which three Democrats, Heidi Heitkamp, McCaskill, and Manchin, if I recall correctly, all voted for them because they were able to run on this, that if they had voted against it, that they would be seen as too far left for their states. I would say that the Kavanaugh nomination will be less advantageous a talking point for Republicans than Gorsuch was, simply because there's been so much public politicization of his nomination, such that red state Democrats have an easy cover, quote unquote, whether that be whatever comes out of the investigation or the uncertainty about other accusers who may or may not have been brought in. The fact that there was this kerfuffle at all, I think, strongly weakens the ability of Republicans to use a vote against Kavanaugh as a weapon against red state Democrats.
Interesting. Now, so that's a lot on the Senate. I want to sort of zoom out, big picture on the Senate one moment before we pivot to the other, obviously, net greater amount of races. So just big picture on the Senate. We've got tons of projections, algorithms, models out there. Will the Democrats take the Senate or will they not? Will the Republicans keep the Senate? They've obviously got a very slim majority right now, 52 to 48 in the Senate, which is not being helped by several high-profile dropouts. Corker, Flake, the death of Senator McCain, leaving Arizona with essentially 2 seats that will need running, and a great many uncertainties with respect to whether or not senators will continue to vote the way the Republicans want them to. How many seats do we think the Democrats need to pick up to effectively change how the Senate works? Does it have to be enough to win a majority, or does it just have to be enough to pull it such that there's only one loose Republican vote? And if they can't pick it up, what will the Republicans consider a win? Do the Republicans have a chance of gaining a margin here, or are they really just looking at sort of a maintenance vote?
I'd have to say for Republicans, this Senate session for these past 2 years has proved that 52-50 is a comfortable margin for them. They've been able to do most of what they want to do without any problems. Kavanaugh is the first real challenge they've faced.
Well, that's not
Well,
entirely
besides
true.
the big
wall.
healthcare.
Yeah, the
And
repeal of
the
healthcare
healthcare
of
and
ACA.
DACA.
Yeah.
Don't you
With
think those are
McCain
big
passed.
challenges?
I would say the healthcare bill was not as much a challenge because the Senate leadership wasn't as committed to it this time around.
McConnell threw a lot of political campaign behind the repeal.
My point though is, if they maintain 52-50, that will be a victory for the Republicans. They can do the majority of what they want to do with 52-50. Democrats, I think their best case reasonable scenario is to get to 50-50 in the Senate, and that means one person coming over the aisle kills something, and that means the Republicans get to maintain day-to-day matters, since obviously Pence would be the deciding vote in a tie. But I think for the Democrats, 50-50 is their practical, should be their practical goal.
Do you think they can go for one extra seat?
I think they can certainly try.
I mean, I think they're trying, but...
But
agree
we have
with.
to remember, what we haven't mentioned in this race so far is that this Senate lineup for these elections heavily favors the Republican side.
I actually read an article which said that this Senate map was the worst in national history for a party, based on how many vulnerable incumbents that there were.
Referring to the Democratic Party.
I agree with almost everything that Jacob said, and the reason that the Democrats have such a hard time in a year that so many people are calling a blue wave, quote unquote, sort of thing, is that they're defending a huge amount of seats which they won in a previous wave election in 2006, kept in the presidential election of 2012, and are now defending again. You got a huge number of vulnerable Democratic incumbents, and a relatively small number of potential seat pickups. I think there is a very slim possibility that the Democrats take the House outright, but I would say that
Take the House outright?
Sorry, yes, the Senate outright.
We'll get to the House.
But I would say that the highest margin of likelihood is that the Senate stays where it is, and it's very possible that the Republicans pick up a seat or two.
So you're projecting maintenance, maybe even a couple of Republican pickups.
I'll tell you exactly what I project.
Oh, man.
We're all looking at the 538 graph.
Everybody
right
loves
now,
the
Joe.
538 graph.
Honestly, though, for our listeners, if any of you are not familiar with 538, they are a decently unbiased look at a lot of good political polling aggregates in very viewer-friendly
Yeah,
ways.
they're probably the best mathematically based pundit out there, but they are still pundits, so that's something to keep in mind.
Of course, of course.
I will say the likeliest margin of possibility is that the Democrats will pick up Nevada and Arizona and lose Florida and North Dakota. That is my official highest margin of possibility projection.
Okay, as long as you're keeping Missouri Democratic, I'm happy.
Though she's quite vulnerable too.
She is vulnerable, but I think she's popular enough she'll stay. All right, so that's sort of where we think the Senate is headed, ATM. Let's pivot to the remaining 435 seats.
Yeah, 435.
Yeah.
Although technically 5 of those are non-voting.
Right. So 400 and it's DC.
Seven.
Are the non-voting ones included in the 435, or are they?
No,
on top?
they are included. They are
Oh,
included, but
okay.
it's U.S. territories.
Okay.
Yeah, it's the territories in DC. So I guess yes. Thank you, George, for the reminder there. We're looking more at 430 real seats that are worth fighting for, and the margin.
Well,
okay.
let's not make
All
value
right.
judgments.
All right, don't even know. So 430 seats that are up for voting grabs. Right now, the margin is I mean, shockingly in favor of the Republicans in the House. Not probabilistically. I'm just saying the number of Republican seats versus the number of Democratic seats. I think it's 277 for the Republicans right now.
Can we back up as to why that is the case? Was that always the case under Obama? Was that the case during the election of
It's
Hillary
been the case
Clinton
since
and
2010.
Trump?
Yeah.
The Republicans had a huge wave election in 2010 and have held
And they
large
used
majorities
it
ever
to
since.
they used it essentially to gerrymander at the state level extensively.
All right.
The census is a whole nother issue and something we should definitely talk about.
Watch out for an
But-
episode on the census.
Yeah, watch
but,
out for an episode on that.
But at the moment, let's talk. You're right. So Joe gave a decent background there. 2010, there was a massive Republican wave election. The birth of the Tea Party, as they called it. A whole bunch of not only Republican House of Representatives, but a whole bunch of new Republican representatives. In fact, Eric Cantor, the long-time Virginia House of Representatives from Northern Virginia, actually, not all the way Northern Virginia, but close, lost his seat to a Republican primary contender who I think still holds the seat. So a huge turnover, not only for the Democrats versus the Republicans, but even within the Republican Party, a massive wave of new blood Republicans and the birth of the Freedom Caucus, which has plagued the Republicans on certain votes ever since. But I'd like to get back to talk just briefly about the numbers. If we want, we can get into the mechanics in a little while. What are we looking at? Every seat in the House is up. But whether or not every seat in the House is an actual runoff is an entirely different question. Many go uncontested on a yearly basis. Many more, while technically contested, are now a real race. They'll come out to margins of 90 to 10%, just because some states are so red or are so blue. For instance, Hawaii's representatives have nothing to fear.
They're blue, right?
They're blue.
Okay.
And Wyoming's one representative is definitely going to be a Republican.
So I think, so when we were talking about the Senate, we were talking about individual races by and large, because the Senate swings very much on these individual races. The House of Representatives, we can't afford to talk about every single race, but we should talk about one very important political institution, and that is the generic congressional ballot. Because it is a very good determiner of who is going to control the House of Representatives. And at the moment, it is a bright, bright blue.
Can you explain for the viewers what that is?
Sure. Jacob,
I think Joe can explain it better than I can, the exact details.
The congressional ballot is, the generic ballot is a very interesting tool as long as you know what it actually means. What it is essentially it's a regular poll which asks people, if there was an election held today, would you vote in your district for a generic Democrat or a generic Republican, which is essentially a referendum on the parties. That said, there are a number of reasons that should not be taken as representative of what the House outcome will actually be. The first thing is that there's no such thing as a generic Democrat or a generic Republican. As we talked about, a lot of races are really local.
And in this case, extremely local.
Very local.
By county, not just by state.
And individuals can have a significant impact on that. Secondly, and possibly more importantly on the macro level, is that popular vote correlates with, but not strongly with, House outcomes. The current projection, I think, is that the Democrats would have to win the House vote by about 8 percentage points to have a chance at actually winning a House majority. And that's both due to actual gerrymandering as well to sort of quote-unquote natural packing. Meaning
malapportionment, basically.
Well, natural packing is an entirely different... It's not something that you can easily gerrymander. It's just that some states are naturally...
Well, the fact of the matter is that urban centers tend to be much more Democratic than countrysides are Republican. We think of the countrysides as sort of the bastion of the Republican Party, but it's more like 60-40 or 70-30, whereas cities tend to be more like 90-10. And the result of that is there's a lot more wasted votes, quote-unquote, for the Democrats than for the Republicans.
Right. So if you're listening and you're thinking about moving... try the countryside.
Nice. Yikes.
No, I'm kidding. Of course, we can have listeners from every party. It's just that it's clear that
plenty of room in Manassas, right?
Oh my God. Manassas, the countryside of Northern Virginia. But yes, we are looking at a great. So Joe, I think that 60-40 split in the countryside gets a little bit to that elasticity question. You're right, it's 60-40 in the countryside, but it's pretty solidly 60-40 for the Republicans. It's not like they need to fear that 20% disappearing anytime soon.
Well, both of the areas that we're talking about, if we're talking about like the heartland of each party, is very inelastic.
Right. So in that case, what we're looking at a lot here is, I think, and my perspective is a little skewed living where I live, but I think that one way that we may need to look at this is the same way that we looked at the Virginia House of Delegates elections, in that the Democrats that did particularly well are those that managed to seize a new wave in suburbs and become... So that's the first group. And the second group are those who are able to run on personality or personal story alone in rural areas. So, we either see a suburb that is fairly elastic, that sort of border region between where no party is safe, and the Democrats using the quote-unquote wave in those suburbs to seize seats. There's one race in Virginia in particular that I'm thinking about, a Republican who is long overdue for unseating. And then there is then there's those who either have a compelling personal story or have some deep connection to the community in their rural district that managed to overcome the odds and turn what was previously an inelastic race into a close one.
All right. So what are the implications of this generic congressional ballot being bright blue with respect to this?
Well, so right now, the particular shade of blue is 7.4 percentage points towards the Democrats. It's great, right? That is a really considerable margin.
It's notably close to Joe's 8% requirement to really consistently consider the Democrats as possible for retaking the House.
Now, what it implies, basically, is that every Democrat going into their race, beginning their race, is going to do 7.4% better than they would in a race where nobody had any opinion about the parties, where they didn't know who the parties were. People prefer Democrats by this margin over Republicans. And what I
nationally speaking, again, it's important to remember.
Right.
Of course, that may not reflect, again, the case in Wyoming or Hawaii, but
where the preferences are different, right?
But those seats were almost never in play to begin with. We're talking about the marginal ones in New York. We're talking about the marginal ones in...
So I want to tell you guys a little story then. Because we're going to talk about our district, actually. Well, some of our districts. Those of us who are registered to vote in Williamsburg.
Are you registered to vote in Williamsburg?
Are you registered to vote in Williamsburg?
Are you, though?
Or at all? Like, the clock's ticking.
Okay, so that actually... A quick plug. No matter what party you belong to, if you're listening to this and it's before your registration deadline in your state...
October 15th here in Virginia. We got to get this out fast.
Register.
If you're an international kid like me, don't.
Well, register to vote in your own...
Are you registered to vote in Jakarta?
Yes.
Nice.
But if I kind of want to talk about our race right here in this district, Elaine Luria versus Scott Taylor. Now, Scott Taylor was elected in the... not in the beginning Tea Party wave, I think. He came in a secondary wave, but he is more or less on the Tea Party end of the Republican spectrum. He is a former Navy veteran.
SEAL,
right? Yeah.
A SEAL.
He's a Navy SEAL.
He was in the armed forces, and he's very conservative. And he holds this district by consistently, I think, 5 or 6 points. And he is currently running against a woman, Elaine Luria, who was also a Navy veteran, or an Army veteran, I can't remember which. But she is a local business owner, deep ties to the area, and she appears to be polling. Now, of course, local polls for congressional districts are not very reliable, but she appears to be polling close, closer than Democrats have in the past. And so this kind of, I think, is emblematic of what Democrats are doing nationally. She is not your typical Democratic candidate, but she is pretty far left as far as the Democratic platform has been historically. She's in favor of, for instance, free health care for, she's in favor of expanding Medicaid, Medicare. She's in favor of a lot of these things, in favor of strongly these environmental policies that are particularly popular in Virginia. And
randomly enough.
Well, we have the Chesapeake Bay.
We have
Surely
the
that's
Chesapeake Bay,
something.
yeah.
I just never think of Virginia being an environmentally centered state with as many pipelines as we tend to build.
Yeah,
for
that's
our
true.
farmland.
That's true.
No, we're all very environmental here. Even the Republicans are environmentalists. But I think what's a key point is that this district is pretty gerrymandered. It was flagged for it at one point. It includes a slice of Williamsburg, the white parts of York County, the white parts of Hampton, and then it leaps across the bay and it gobbles up half of the eastern shore. It's kind of a silly district. It's drawn badly, and yet Elaine Luria is still competitive in this district. And I think that is indicative of a kind of national trend. This is like a little slice that we can take out of it, that Democrats are competitive in areas where they should not be competitive without a redrawing of lines.
But let's take a look at that, shall we? Because it doesn't matter how competitive they are. You can lose by 0.001%. Okay, barring of course the rerun, the recount that would happen. But I'm just talking about realistically. You can lose by 0.001% and still lose, and that is key. Is this wave going to be strong enough to push Democrats from definitely losing to we just happen to lose? Or is it going to push all the way past to marginal wins? And that's the key difference. A marginal win still counts. A marginal loss matters very little.
We won't know definitely until we actually see the results, but I think it would be very interesting to see, in context of, larger political national trends, it'd be interesting to see if the Democrats did not, cross the threshold, what kind of messaging that would send about the current administration, the state of politics in the nation. It's just, would that be a positive reaffirmation of the current direction of, the Trump administration? I don't know.
Or would it simply be a status quo vote on the part of voters in that most seats are held by Republicans and they just voted for whoever is currently holding their seat?
You mean the usual, nothing bad's really happening to me. I don't really care.
Maybe the incumbency thing works against the Democrats here. I mean, not maybe. It certainly will. But how badly it works against the Democrats, a lot of these variables are very up in the air. I think we could pick this apart for another hour. But we are starting to run out of time. Just a quick hot take from everybody around the table as we close off. Not on whether or not the Democrats will retake either of these houses, but if the Democrats were to retake either one of these houses, what happens? Do we see a massive resistance movements towards the other house? So if they retake the Senate, they're not passing any House bills. They retake the House, they're not passing any Senate bills. Or do we see them attempting to find compromise solutions to oppose the president? Maybe the Republicans start saying, now that we've got a Democratic-controlled House, we feel strongly that we can oppose the president on certain radical policies. What does it mean in a hypothetical world where the Democrats take at least one of these two houses? We'll start with George.
I'm going to put forth the imaginary world in which case the Democrats win the House and the Republicans, by perhaps a small margin, retain the Senate. I don't see Republican leadership going against the Trump administration on the quote-unquote radical policy changes because I don't think that I just don't see Mitch McConnell taking the rest of the Republicans to go against, the president's agenda. Vast majority of the Republicans, mainstream Republicans and those that are well tied to leadership, they fear to go against Donald Trump, and I really don't see that happening. I think what we're more likely to see is a replay of sort of like the lame duck session of Barack Obama, where the Democrats held the Senate and the Republicans held the House. Well, not the lame duck session, the one right before that, back before the Republicans retook the Senate. When basically we had the warring parties. You had the Democrats in the Senate with the Republicans in the House and the Democratic president, and they basically all coalesced against each other, and very little got done. There was very strong gridlock, and that's back when we had the old battles about shutdowns, and it was terrible. I think we're more likely to see a replay of that sort of situation.
All right, Vince, different take, same take.
Somewhat in the same direction. I think that if they take either one of the houses, there will be a better chance at resisting a lot of Donald Trump's policies, and I think that will happen, but not through, say, appeasing or negotiating with, say, Mitch McConnell, but just straight up outvoting through the House or the Senate.
All right, Joe?
I want to take a different take. I agree with what's been said so far on the political front. I think the key thing about controlling the House for the Democrats is, while if they don't take the Senate, they won't be able to pass anything, they will gain control of those committees which have to do, for example, with investigative powers. And I think if the Democrats retake the House, you'll see a lot of the things that have currently been shut down by what's his name? Nunes, right?
Nunes.
And the people on the investigative committee will become unleashed, and the current scope of the Mueller investigation will be expanded vastly.
Oh, that's right. I forgot about the Mueller investigation.
Never forget about Mueller investigation. It's always Mueller time.
We need to do another episode on Mueller. I think I'm going to have to agree with Joe. I hope and I think it is likely that we will see a Democratic House, and that will expand the scope of the investigation. I think that in the Senate, if we see that 50-50 split, that is going to be the end of politics for the next 2 years, essentially. Obviously people are still going to be grandstanding, but there aren't going to be bills passing.
Well, the bills will pass, but it's the same kind of stuff that nobody ever pays attention to.
I bet they'll name a lot of bridges.
It'll be late night fights and trying to narrowly miss shutdowns just to pass the budget, the continuing resolutions to keep funding going.
I think we'll see a worsening of the fights we saw over healthcare. I think we'll see probably another couple of shutdowns. It's not going to be pretty.
Well, it's a bleak outlook, but it's an interesting outlook. Thank you all for listening to this episode of Talking TWAMPs. If you liked this episode, please feel free to check out the podcasting network at William & Mary, which you can search on any podcasting app, be it iTunes or whatever you're listening to this podcast on. We have a great selection of different podcasts that don't just cover politics, and that we would welcome you to listen to. Also, just a quick reminder for our listeners that the opinions expressed on this podcast are those held by those who expressed those opinions. And though we do bear the podcasting network of William & Mary, that last William & Mary bit does not mean that our opinions represent those of the college. Thank you again for listening, and have a good rest of your day.